January 1943. The sun rose over the Pacific horizon, casting long shadows across jagged cliffs and dense jungle canopies. From above, the islands looked serene, emerald patches in a vast, restless ocean. But beneath the green, steel, concrete, and earth waited. Bunkers bristled with artillery, pillboxes lined every ridge, and hidden machine gun nests turned every beach into a killing field. Footpaths carved into the jungle twisted unpredictably, booby-trapped and watched. 110,000 Japanese soldiers were stationed across these fortresses, each man trained, armed, and determined to hold every inch against any enemy. The air carried the metallic tang of preparation, ammunition crates stacked, flamethrowers readied, and communication wires strung taut through the undergrowth. From the sea, reconnaissance planes traced the coastline, spotting nothing of the immensity of the defenses within. Every approach seemed natural, almost peaceful. But this calm was a trap. One misstep, one wrong landing, and the ocean would become a graveyard. Yet somewhere over the horizon, US forces were preparing to bypass these impregnable fortresses entirely, changing the rules of engagement in the Pacific forever. By late 1941, Japan's empire spanned thousands of miles across the Pacific, from the Philippines to New Guinea, from the Marianas to the Solomon Islands. Each captured territory was rapidly fortified, a network of strongpoints, airfields, and supply depots designed to create an impenetrable defensive web. The Japanese military leadership, hardened by years of conflict in China, understood that holding these islands would require more than numbers. It demanded engineering, discipline, and terrain mastery. Coral reefs, steep cliffs, dense jungle, and volcanic soil were all weaponized. Beaches were mined, obstacles embedded in shallow waters to destroy landing craft, and cliffs dotted with hidden artillery positions overlooked every approach. The Imperial Army and Navy coordinated to place over 110,000 men across these islands, an army in wait, anticipating the inevitable American counter-offensive. Every island became a fortress. On Tarawa, concrete bunkers and interlocking machine gun nests made frontal assaults deadly. On Peleliu, hills were hollowed into defensive tunnels, connected by miles of underground passages that allowed troops to emerge behind attacking forces. Rabaul, in New Britain, was transformed into a command hub, its airfields protected by anti-aircraft, batteries, trenches, and camouflaged bunkers. The Japanese believed that these fortifications could force the US into costly, attritional battles, exhausting men and materiel before the heart of the empire itself was threatened. Japan's defensive doctrine was clear: deny the enemy beachheads, fight relentlessly, and inflict maximum casualties. Every soldier was trained to hold positions to the death. Every bunker was engineered to survive bombardments, and every ridgeline, jungle path, and river crossing was prepared to channel, trap, and destroy invading forces. The psychological impact was as important as the physical. US commanders would later describe these islands as ticking coffins, landscapes designed to erode morale as much as manpower. Intelligence reports from early 1942 confirmed the scale: tens of thousands of troops, artillery emplacements with ranges covering every approach, and logistical networks capable of sustaining prolonged sieges. Yet, even with meticulous preparation, weaknesses existed. Supply lines were long, reliant on convoys vulnerable to submarine attacks. Air superiority was contested. Reinforcements could arrive only with difficulty. The Japanese command structure was rigid, decisions centralized, and flexibility limited. While troops were highly disciplined, they often lacked the ability to adapt independently to dynamic battlefield conditions. For the US, this network of fortresses presented a paradox. Direct assaults promised heavy casualties, yet leaving these positions intact risked supply lines and future campaigns. Early encounters, such as at Wake Island and Guam, had demonstrated the lethality of Japanese fortifications. American planners understood that conventional tactics, massive amphibious assaults, would be bloody and slow. The challenge was not merely to land troops, but to neutralize fortresses designed to be lethal and self-sustaining. The island's geography, combined with Japanese ingenuity, made intelligence collection difficult. Reconnaissance aircraft could survey coastlines, but inland defenses remained hidden beneath jungle canopy, behind artificial terrain or underground. Maps were incomplete. Estimates of troop strength varied widely. Every piece of intelligence carried uncertainty. Meanwhile, U.S. military technology was evolving to meet the challenge. Landing craft capable of navigating reefs, specialized naval bombardment techniques, and amphibious doctrine were developed to offset entrenched defenses. Yet, despite preparation, commanders knew they faced a daunting task. Each fortified island was a microcosm of total war, engineered, armed, and ready to consume attackers in a deliberate, calculated slaughter. The stage was set. Across the Pacific, the Japanese awaited. On the beaches, artillery lay in wait. In tunnels and bunkers, soldiers braced. Above, patrol planes scanned the horizon, unaware that American forces were about to employ strategies that would render these seemingly impregnable fortresses almost irrelevant. Every moment built tension. Every map and report highlighted the scale of the challenge. The calm of the islands masked the storm to come. By mid-1942, the United States had absorbed the shock of Pearl Harbor and the rapid Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. The Pacific Fleet was weakened, key bases lost, and morale tested. Yet, strategic thinking within the U.S. Navy and Army began to crystallize around a doctrine that would redefine the campaign: island hopping. Instead of engaging every fortified position, planners identified key islands whose capture would provide airfields, naval bases, and logistical footholds, allowing the U.S. to bypass heavily defended positions and isolate them. This approach promised to reduce casualties, maintain operational momentum, and undermine Japanese strategic depth without direct confrontation at every strong point. Intelligence was critical. A combination of aerial reconnaissance, code breaking, and intercepted communications revealed Japanese troop deployments, fortification patterns, and supply routes. Maps, produced by the Japanese themselves, often obtained through espionage or prisoner interrogations, provided insights into bunker placements, artillery ranges, and trench networks. Despite the accuracy of some reports, much remained uncertain. Thick jungle and rugged terrain concealed underground tunnels and hidden artillery. Coral reefs and tidal flats complicated landings, while tropical storms and unpredictable currents added further risk. The U.S. command had to plan with imperfect data, relying on simulations, war games, and prior amphibious operations for guidance. The technological dimension became a decisive factor. Naval bombardments, once limited in range and accuracy, were augmented with advanced targeting and heavy-caliber guns. Amphibious landing craft were redesigned to cross reefs and deliver troops directly onto beaches under fire. Aircraft carriers provided air cover, reconnaissance, and close support for advancing troops. Specialized units trained in demolition, flamethrower tactics, and bunker clearance were deployed to breach fortifications. Every technological advantage was leveraged to counter the Japanese doctrine of attritional defense. Command decisions were equally crucial. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, coordinated closely with Army planners under General Douglas MacArthur and Marine Corps leadership. Nimitz emphasized mobility, flexibility, and the avoidance of unnecessary frontal assaults. He recognized the futility of engaging every stronghold, focusing instead on islands that would yield strategic airfields and control of sea lanes. MacArthur, meanwhile, concentrated on the Southwest Pacific, using amphibious operations to cut Japanese supply lines, isolate garrisons, and build a series of stepping stones toward the Philippines. Coordination between branches was complex but essential. The island's geography often forced Navy and Army units to operate in close conjunction under enemy fire. Despite careful planning, the scale of Japanese fortifications remained daunting. Islands such as Tarawa, and Saipan were engineered to withstand prolonged bombardments. Every ridge, bunker, and cave had been surveyed and reinforced. Japanese troops, numbering tens of thousands, were disciplined, highly motivated, and indoctrinated with the belief that surrender was dishonorable. Casualty projections for frontal assaults were grim. U.S. commanders knew that bypassing some positions entirely would test morale and logistics, but it offered the only feasible path toward advancing across the Pacific. By late 1942, initial operations tested these theories. The landings at Guadalcanal, a key airfield hub in the Solomon Islands, demonstrated the challenges of jungle combat, amphibious coordination, and supply under fire. Japanese counterattacks were fierce, defensive networks complex, and attrition high. Lessons from Guadalcanal informed subsequent campaigns. Reconnaissance had to be meticulous, coordination precise, and specialized units ready to neutralize entrenched positions. Naval and air firepower had to be concentrated and timed with infantry movements. Every mistake was costly, every success hard-won. In parallel, Japanese command remained confident in the impregnable nature of their fortresses. Reinforcements were scarce, but the sheer density of troops and fortifications created the perception that no enemy could force a breakthrough without catastrophic losses. Intelligence overestimation of Japanese capabilities reinforced the fear among U.S. planners, even as they developed tactics to circumvent the most lethal positions. The stage was set for a series of engagements where planning, technology, and audacity would collide against one of the most formidable defensive networks of the war. The contrast was clear. The Japanese prepared to fight a war of attrition, anchored in static defense. The Americans prepared to move around, above, and through those defenses, challenging assumptions about what impregnable really meant. The islands themselves would become testing grounds for strategy, technology, and the human cost of modern warfare. For the Japanese soldiers, life on these fortified islands was a mixture of monotony, vigilance, and constant preparation. Weeks, sometimes months, were spent digging trenches, reinforcing bunkers, and maintaining artillery positions under oppressive heat and relentless humidity. Food shortages and tropical diseases were constant companions. Discipline was strict, orders were obeyed without question, and the code of Bushido demanded absolute loyalty and readiness to die in defense of the empire. Every soldier internalized the expectation that surrender was dishonorable, creating a psychological barrier to retreat or negotiation. Morale was tied to the belief in the fortress itself. Each bunker, pillbox, and hidden machine gun nest was a symbol of their mission's inevitability. Yet fear remained pervasive. Troops understood that any American landing would test their endurance, their courage, and the limits of human resilience. The human element was as critical as concrete and steel. The willingness of men to fight to the death made these fortresses formidable, far beyond their physical defenses. Japanese defensive strategy emphasized depth, interlocking fields of fire, and terrain exploitation. Beaches were not merely obstacles but traps. Coral reefs and submerged stakes slowed landing craft, exposing troops to artillery and machine gun fire. Hills and ridges were fortified with bunkers connected by concealed paths, allowing troops to reposition and fire upon advancing forces from multiple angles. Every approach funneled attackers into kill zones. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and naval observers created a network defense capable of reacting dynamically to assault. Defensive positions were layered, initial beach defenses, secondary inland bunkers, and hidden tunnels for counterattacks. The goal was not merely to hold ground but to inflict maximum casualties, buying time for reinforcements or prolonging resistance until attrition eroded enemy strength. Tactical ingenuity transformed natural terrain into a force multiplier, making each fortress a self-contained battlefield. Japanese fortifications leveraged a combination of contemporary engineering and improvised ingenuity. Concrete bunkers resisted naval bombardment, while reinforced pillboxes housed heavy machine guns, artillery, and mortars. Flamethrower-resistant shelters and underground tunnels allowed troops to survive pre-landing bombardments. Observation posts integrated rudimentary radar and optical range finding to direct artillery accurately at incoming landing craft. Defensive mines, barbed wire, and obstacles in surf zones slowed assaults, forcing troops into concentrated zones under fire. Communications relied on wired networks, field radios, and visual signals, allowing rapid coordination between dispersed positions. Technological design amplified the human factor, ensuring that every soldier's effectiveness was maximized and that defenses could endure both bombardment and prolonged siege. Japanese command prioritized centralized control and meticulous preparation. Generals and admirals directed fortification placement, troop deployment, and resource allocation with rigid discipline. Leaders like Admiral Tomoyuki Yamashita and General Kuribayashi emphasized holding positions at all costs, instilling a philosophy of total defense. Orders were precise, leaving little room for improvisation, which ensured coordinated resistance but limited adaptive flexibility in the face of unexpected maneuvers. On the American side, commanders like Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Holland M. Smith emphasized mobility, integration of air, land and sea power, and exploiting intelligence gaps. U.S. leaders faced the challenge of coordinating complex amphibious operations, anticipating Japanese defensive patterns, and minimizing casualties. Leadership effectiveness became a decisive factor. Japanese rigidity met American adaptability, creating a conflict between static and dynamic command doctrines that would shape the outcome of the Pacific Campaign. From the Japanese viewpoint, U.S. forces were an existential threat, advancing with overwhelming material, superiority, and innovative tactics. Fortresses were expected to blunt enemy assaults, yet reconnaissance and intelligence hinted at unconventional approaches. Japanese soldiers feared the aerial and naval firepower capable of neutralizing static positions before ground troops even landed. Commanders recognized that bypassed islands could be isolated, but remained concerned about airfield and supply line vulnerabilities. The psychological burden of anticipating amphibious landings under relentless bombardment influenced defensive posture, resource allocation, and morale. The enemy perspective underscores how perceived invincibility of fortifications was constantly challenged by the reality of American operational innovation. The island's fortifications were designed not only to impede physical assault, but to erode morale. For American troops, the sheer scale of defenses, pillboxes, trenches, artillery, created an initial sense of dread. For Japanese defenders, isolation, harsh conditions, and the expectation of death produced both resilience and stress. Psychological endurance became as critical as physical readiness. Fear, anticipation, and the weight of expectation shaped decision-making, engagement tactics, and overall effectiveness. The human mind, confronted with engineered death zones, became a battlefield in itself. November 20th, 1943. The island of Tarawa, part of the Gilbert Islands chain, became the first major test of the U.S. strategy to confront Japan's heavily fortified positions. From the air, the atoll appeared deceptively small, a cluster of coral reefs and sandbars fringed by turquoise water. U.S. Marines approached under the cover of pre-dawn darkness. Naval bombardment had pounded the island for days, yet reconnaissance had already revealed the limitations. Bunkers survived, artillery remained operational, and Japanese troops held their positions with precision. The landing craft moved forward, engines straining against the shallow reefs. Many struck coral, trapping troops under fire. The first waves hit the beaches directly in front of entrenched pillboxes. Machine gun fire swept across the sand, cutting down men before they could reach cover. Mortar and artillery rounds erupted from inland positions, tearing into formations. Commanders on the landing craft shouted orders that were almost inaudible over the roar of destruction. Small units adapted quickly, using tanks to suppress fire, flamethrowers to clear bunkers, and demolition teams to breach obstacles. The cost was immediate. Within hours, hundreds of Marines were killed or wounded, the beach littered with bodies and equipment. Yet the attack persisted. American forces began to isolate Japanese positions, moving through canals and across reef flats that had been expected to stall them indefinitely. Tanks provided mobile cover for infantry, and coordinated artillery fire suppressed key enemy strongpoints. Japanese defenders emerged from tunnels for short, lethal sorties, then vanished again, forcing Marines to clear positions room by room. Each advance was measured, exhausting, and bloody. Commanders realized that even with overwhelming firepower, the island's fortifications demanded maximum effort to overcome. The battle at Tarawa became a proving ground for operational coordination. Naval gunfire, aerial strikes, and infantry assaults had to be synchronized down to the minute. Communication networks, previously considered secondary, were critical. Delays or miscalculations meant mass casualties. Intelligence gained from pre-battle reconnaissance proved partially accurate. Bunkers had been correctly located, but hidden tunnels and fortified passages had been underestimated. The human cost highlighted the intensity of Japanese preparation. Men had been trained, positioned, and psychologically conditioned to hold every meter of ground. Meanwhile, US commanders observed a pattern emerging. Japanese defenses were designed for attrition but not for isolation. Reinforcements could not reach all positions quickly. By systematically bypassing heavily fortified areas while concentrating fire on critical nodes, American forces began to dismantle the defensive network piece by piece. The tactical lesson was clear. Overwhelming force and mobility, combined with detailed planning, could reduce the advantage of static fortifications. The climax of the engagement was not a single moment, but a series of cascading breakthroughs. Key pillboxes were destroyed, inland trenches captured, and artillery positions silenced. Marines moved methodically, exploiting gaps and weaknesses. The Japanese, despite discipline and determination, could not replace lost positions quickly enough to regain momentum. By the end of the third day, the island's main defenses had been neutralized, though at staggering cost. Casualty reports indicated over 1,000 American dead, with twice that number wounded. Japanese losses were almost total. Their once formidable garrison decimated, their fortifications rendered impotent against coordinated amphibious strategy. This first phase of the Pacific Campaign revealed a critical insight. Even the most elaborate and densely manned fortresses were vulnerable when confronted with flexible strategy, superior coordination, and technological integration. Tarawa became a blueprint for future operations, demonstrating that bypassing or directly engaging fortified islands required precision, adaptation, and relentless determination. The stage was now set for larger, more complex operations in the Marianas and the Philippines, where American forces would refine these lessons under even greater pressure. June 15, 1944. Saipan, part of the Mariana Islands, became the next test of US operational ingenuity. Unlike Tarawa, Saipan was larger, with dense jungle, rugged terrain, and coastal cliffs designed to channel attackers into lethal kill zones. Japanese forces numbered over 30,000, dug into reinforced bunkers, caves, and hidden artillery positions. Observers on US ships noted the formidable defenses, coastal gun emplacements, interlocking machine gun nests, and tunnels snaking into the hills, allowing defenders to emerge unexpectedly. The invasion began under the cover of a pre-dawn naval and aerial bombardment. Heavy cruisers and battleships targeted coastal fortifications while carrier-based aircraft strafed inland positions. Landing craft advanced toward the beaches, deploying Marines and Army infantry under withering fire. Obstacles hidden beneath surf slowed many units, forcing soldiers into narrow channels under concentrated artillery and machine gun fire. Yet this time planners had adapted. Specialized amphibious vehicles capable of crossing coral reefs provided cover and mobility, while engineers cleared obstacles rapidly. Tanks and artillery moved ashore in precise coordination, providing continuous suppressive fire. Japanese defenders responded with fanatical intensity. Infantry sorties emerged from tunnels, striking suddenly before disappearing back underground. Mortars and artillery rained on landing zones, and counterattacks attempted to isolate beachheads. Commanders in the field faced split-second decisions, balancing aggressive advancement against the risk of annihilation. US forces relied on combined arms coordination. Airstrikes neutralized inland artillery, naval gunfire suppressed key positions, and infantry cleared tunnels and pillboxes systematically. The battle became a sequence of brutal engagements, each small advance bought at enormous cost. By the third day, US forces began to penetrate the island's interior. Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized attrition, but American mobility and concentration of force began to fracture their lines. Hilltops and ridge positions, once considered impregnable, were captured using coordinated infantry assaults supported by flamethrowers and demolition charges. US commanders leveraged intelligence from captured maps, prisoners, and aerial reconnaissance to anticipate defensive patterns, gradually reducing Japanese operational effectiveness. The defenders, isolated and under relentless pressure, faced dwindling ammunition and supplies. The turning point came when US forces seized the central high ground, cutting off Japanese lines of retreat and supply. Remaining troops attempted desperate counterattacks, but these were repelled systematically. Bunkers and pillboxes, once symbols of invincibility, were destroyed one by one. Communications between Japanese positions collapsed, and command authority weakened as isolated units faced annihilation. By the end of the first week, the majority of strategic positions had been neutralized, though isolated pockets continued to resist. Casualty figures highlighted the human cost. Over 3,400 Americans dead and more than 10,000 wounded. Japanese losses exceeded 24,000, with most killed in action. The ferocity of resistance underscored the preparation, discipline, and indoctrination of Japanese defenders. Yet the operational principles of bypass, concentrated force, and integrated technology proved decisive. Saipan's capture provided a strategic airfield within range of the Japanese home islands, signaling a turning point in the Pacific campaign. The engagement demonstrated that no fortress, however well defended, could withstand the combination of intelligence, technology, and flexible strategy. Japanese planning had assumed static defense would halt invaders, but American adaptation rendered those assumptions obsolete. Lessons from Saipan informed subsequent operations in the Marianas, Palau, and the Philippines, reshaping amphibious warfare doctrine and redefining the limits of entrenched fortifications. The stage was now set for the final phase of the Pacific Island campaign, the psychological and strategic aftermath. Japanese forces, though tenacious, faced isolation and attrition on multiple fronts. U.S. forces had proven that impregnable fortresses could be bypassed, breached, and neutralized, altering the trajectory of the war across the Pacific. The islands that once symbolized invincibility now stood as testaments to the evolving nature of warfare, where innovation, coordination, and determination could render even the most formidable defenses ultimately vulnerable. The capture of Tarawa and Saipan marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific theater, illustrating both the limits of Japanese fortifications and the effectiveness of American operational adaptation. The immediate consequence was the establishment of critical footholds in the Central Pacific, enabling subsequent island-hopping campaigns that bypassed the most heavily defended positions. Airfields on Saipan allowed long-range bombers to strike the Japanese home islands for the first time, creating a strategic threat that fundamentally altered Tokyo's defensive calculations. Tarawa, though smaller, provided lessons that would influence amphibious operations for the remainder of the war. Pre-landing bombardments were insufficient alone, and combined arms coordination was essential to minimize casualties and neutralize entrenched positions. The human cost on both sides was staggering. U.S. Marines and Army personnel suffered thousands of casualties in each engagement, their survival often dependent on ingenuity, discipline, and small unit leadership under fire. The Japanese defenders, indoctrinated to fight to the death, incurred almost total losses. Entire battalions were annihilated, their bodies buried in the coral sands or within collapsed bunkers. Survivors who surrendered were few, their psychological state shattered by the relentless bombardments, isolation, and the collapse of command structures. The Japanese military's assumption that fortifications could withstand protracted assault proved flawed when confronted with American mobility, intelligence, and firepower integration. Strategically, these victories shifted the balance of power across the Pacific. Japanese command had invested heavily in static defense, concentrating tens of thousands of troops and resources on islands that, once bypassed or breached, became liabilities rather than assets. U.S. planners now had operational evidence that bypassing strongpoints, while isolating and neutralizing them through air and naval superiority, was more efficient than costly frontal assaults. This doctrine would be repeated in the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and later the Philippines, allowing U.S. forces to advance with fewer casualties, while systematically eroding Japanese capacity to resist. Intelligence and reconnaissance emerged as decisive factors in operational success. Pre-invasion aerial photography, prisoner interrogations, and intercepted communications allowed commanders to anticipate Japanese defensive layouts, though not perfectly. Even partial intelligence, combined with flexible tactics and technological support, proved sufficient to overcome fortified positions. The psychological effect on Japanese leadership was profound. They realized that impregnable fortresses could no longer guarantee strategic advantage, and that isolation, attrition, and mobility were becoming the dominant determinants of battlefield success. Beyond immediate military outcomes, these battles affected planning at the highest levels. Lessons from Tarawa and Saipan prompted revisions to amphibious doctrine, including the development of specialized landing craft, improved pre-assault bombardment coordination, and enhanced integration of engineers and demolition teams. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps refined joint operational procedures, ensuring that subsequent invasions would be faster, more coordinated, and less vulnerable to the defensive advantages the Japanese had painstakingly constructed. The aftermath also carried symbolic significance. Japanese fortresses, once considered impregnable, had been systematically dismantled. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. American morale soared, validating the concept of bypass and attritional avoidance. Japanese propagandists, once confident in the myth of invincible island defenses, faced the reality that modern warfare demanded flexibility, technological adaptation, and operational innovation. The fall of these islands was a tangible demonstration that no combination of fortification, terrain, or troop discipline could indefinitely resist a well-coordinated, technologically supported, and strategically adaptive opponent. This phase of the campaign set the conditions for the next stage: long-term isolation of Japanese strongholds, continued attritional pressure, and the gradual collapse of Japan's Pacific defensive network. Islands once seen as the cornerstone of imperial security became isolated, their garrisons ineffective against long-range bombardment and supply interdiction. The transition from entrenched defense to operational bypass marked a profound shift in the conduct of the Pacific War, redefining how victory was achieved against heavily fortified positions. Following the capture of Saipan, the broader consequences for the Pacific campaign became immediately apparent. The island's fall provided the United States with a forward base capable of supporting strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands. B-29 superfortresses, which would soon operate from newly constructed airfields, transformed the war from a regional conflict into a direct threat to the Japanese mainland. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was profound. They now faced the reality that their homeland was within reach of sustained aerial assault, undermining the perception of invulnerability that had guided defensive strategy for years. Japanese forces on other fortified islands experienced increasing isolation. Cut off from resupply and reinforcement, garrisons on bypassed islands were gradually reduced to starvation and attrition. The U.S. adopted a strategy of encirclement and containment, leaving heavily fortified positions intact but neutralized through blockade and air superiority. This approach minimized American casualties while systematically eroding Japanese operational capacity. Islands such as Truk, Rabaul, and Peleliu became strategically irrelevant, their troops trapped, unable to influence the broader course of the war. The fall of Saipan demonstrated that strategic bypass, combined with technological advantage and coordinated multi-branch operations, could nullify the Japanese doctrine of total defense. The human toll extended beyond immediate casualties. Japanese soldiers, trapped in isolated fortresses, faced months of deprivation, while American forces internalized the lessons of extreme lethality in frontal assaults. After-action reports emphasized the importance of reconnaissance, inter-branch coordination, and pre-assault engineering support. The battles also influenced training, emphasizing psychological preparation for extreme environments, close-quarter combat, and the need to adapt to unexpected defensive structures. These operational lessons would shape the conduct of campaigns through the Marianas, the Philippines, and ultimately Okinawa. Strategically, the implications were far-reaching. Japanese command recognized that static fortifications, no matter how elaborate, could not stop an adversary capable of mobility, intelligence-driven planning, and superior firepower. American operational doctrine evolved to exploit these vulnerabilities systematically, combining naval, air, and land capabilities into synchronized campaigns that minimized attritional losses while maintaining momentum. The Pacific theater shifted decisively in favor of the United States, as the Japanese defensive network, once considered impregnable, became a series of isolated expendable positions. The psychological and moral dimensions were equally significant. The myth of invincible fortresses was shattered, impacting both Japanese and American perceptions of the campaign. U.S. troops gained confidence in their ability to confront entrenched defenses, while Japanese troops and commanders faced the demoralizing reality that careful preparation alone could not ensure victory. Fortresses that had been symbols of Japanese strength now stood as testaments to the limits of static defense against a determined, adaptive, and technologically capable adversary. These events also influenced post-battle military assessments. After-action analyses, intelligence debriefs, and captured Japanese documents confirmed the effectiveness of combined arms operations, the importance of bypassing unnecessary strongpoints, and the decisive role of technological integration. Lessons from these campaigns would inform not only ongoing operations but also post-war military planning, highlighting the need for flexibility, innovation, and adaptability in modern warfare. By neutralizing or bypassing Japan's fortified islands, the US forced a strategic recalibration that accelerated the collapse of Japanese control across the Pacific. The fall of Saipan and Tarawa demonstrated that fortified positions, no matter how extensive, could be overcome through planning, mobility, and integration of technology and intelligence. The operational and psychological effects reverberated throughout the theater, setting the stage for further advances toward the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, and ultimately preparing the conditions for the final strikes against Japan. The campaign across the Pacific Islands revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare: static fortifications, no matter how elaborate, cannot withstand an opponent capable of adaptation, coordination, and technological application. Japan's network of fortresses, manned by disciplined and determined troops, had been designed to inflict maximum casualties and delay enemy advance. For months, these islands were viewed as impregnable, symbols of the empire's reach and defensive ingenuity. Yet, the combination of intelligence, mobility, and integrated firepower systematically neutralized their effectiveness, reshaping the tactical and strategic landscape of the Pacific War. Human endurance, discipline, and ingenuity were tested on both sides. For Japanese defenders, loyalty and indoctrination demanded ultimate sacrifice, often against overwhelming odds. For American forces, survival depended on rapid adaptation, precise coordination, and the capacity to operate in chaotic, lethal environments. These engagements highlighted not only the physical dimension of warfare but the psychological one, where fear, expectation, and resolve shaped outcomes as decisively as weapons or terrain. Strategically, the fall of fortified islands accelerated the collapse of Japanese defensive networks. The US demonstrated that bypassing strongpoints, isolating garrisons, and leveraging technology could achieve objectives with fewer casualties while maintaining operational momentum. Airfields captured on islands like Saipan extended the reach of strategic bombing, signaling a new phase in the Pacific campaign. The direct threat to the Japanese homeland. Historically, these battles underscore the limits of static defense in the age of combined arms warfare. Impregnable fortresses were never truly invulnerable. Their strength depended on isolation from flexible, well-coordinated adversaries. The lessons of Tarawa, Saipan, and other fortified positions informed not only the remainder of the Pacific War, but the broader evolution of amphibious doctrine, engineering, and operational planning. In the end, the islands stand as both graveyards and classrooms. They bear witness to the cost of human resilience, the ingenuity of military planning, and the relentless calculus of modern war. The campaign reshaped the Pacific, challenged assumptions of invincibility, and demonstrated that adaptability, intelligence, and technological integration defined the decisive edge, not mere numbers, fortifications, or terrain. The legacy of these engagements remains a study in the intersection of human will, strategy, and the unforgiving realities of combat.